Thank you for downloading this podcast from the British Theatre Guide. For more information about British Theatre Guide, please visit britishtheatreguide.info.
Imitating the Dog has been making theatre work fusing live performance with digital technology and projection for 21 years. Their past productions have included original devised work as well as adaptations from other forms such as A Farewell to Arms and Heart of Darkness. Their new show, Night of the Living Dead Remix, is being co-produced with Leeds Playhouse. It's described as a shot-for-shot stage recreation of George A. Romero's classic 1968 zombie movie, Night of the Living Dead. Joining co-director Andrew Quick to discuss the show and the company's work in general is Morven Macbeth, who is one of the actors in Night of the Living Dead Remix and a regular core member of Imitating the Dog. Morven has been working with the company since 2005 and most recently appeared in Heart of Darkness with them. Hi Andrew.
Hello.
Hi Morven.
Hello.
Thanks for chatting with us. I want to start just by noting that Imitating the Dog has recently celebrated its 21st birthday. So I just thought we might start by hearing a bit about the company's history. Perhaps, Andrew, if you could take us back to its founding, its very early days.
Yes, well, it came out of Lancaster University, third-year final show, and a group of students did a piece that was very, very strong. That I happened to be supervising. I was working at Lancaster University at that time, as I still am. And the group decided to rework that piece, which was called I'm Malice Kaimal, and it went to the National Student Drama Festival and won a number of prizes. It was a devised piece. It was quite interesting. And out of that, the company established itself in Leeds and made a series of works that were more physical, I think, than technological. But technology always haunted the work, and the work was very much influenced by cinematic stories. It was very cinematic in its feel and its look without using cameras and that kind of thing. And then in the early 2000s, we started to be much more interested in technology. And we made a piece in Leeds which used screens and back projection for the first time. And then we started working with Pete Brooks, who I'd known for quite some time when he had worked for a company called Impact back in the early 80s, late 70s. Again, they were based in Leeds before they moved to London. And that's when Morven started to work with us, and we made a show called Hotel Methuselah, which really explicitly looked at the sort of cinematic relationship between theatre and film. And then we made a series of pieces with Pete, Hotel Methuselah 2005, Kellerman 2007-8, yeah. 0 Hour, 6 Degrees Below the Horizon, and then we started to do larger scale, middle scale adaptations of works, and the first of those was A Farewell to Arms, which I think is 2014. I'm getting all my dates right here. We did Heart of Darkness in 2018, and now, 21 years later, which feels like a hell of a long time, we're doing Night of the Living Dead. I don't know if you want to say anything more than about your experience of joining the company.
Yeah, well, I joined the company in 2005, as Andrew said, when we made Hotel Methuselah. I'd been out of drama school for 3 years and doing a combination, really, of more traditional theatre work and, guess what we would describe as physical theatre up until that point. I'd had quite a lot of dance training, so that was feeding into the physical theatre work that I was doing. And then when Pete described the idea, Pete and I were friends, and when he described the idea behind Hotel Methuselah and described the work of Imitating the Dog, we all thought that that would be a good meeting of minds. And Hotel Methuselah, I think, remains, possibly for sentimental reasons, but I think it remains my favourite show. It was very stripped back, very beautiful, it had a real elegance to it, very cinematic, and really sort of played with the audience's expectations of what live theatre is. And I think that experiment for me has continued through the 15 years of working with Imitating the Dog. And if you told me when I left drama school that I would develop a relationship with one theatre company over 15 years, I would have bitten your hand off. Yeah. So really, I feel really lucky, really privileged to be in that position. I think it's unusual.
Yeah, yes, I'm sure. Thinking about the overlaps perhaps with your other work, your physical training, your dance training, your physical work, does that come into play in these shows at all? Because, I've seen one so far. I'm looking forward to the new one. But it's not what you would consider traditionally as a physical theatre sort of style of making work, I suppose.
All the work is very choreographic. So all of the performers, as well as following their character arcs in a more traditional sense and way of thinking of it, we all have a very fixed, very precise stage choreography, because we're often operating cameras, because we're often operating moving set pieces around, operating an aperture to open and close on the earlier work. It's very, very complicated and physically demanding what we're doing in the space. So it's unusual in that respect. When you're on stage, you're performing as you would in a regular show. But as soon as you step off stage, invariably, you've got 101 things to do backstage before you're on again.
Yeah, so it's kind of exercising a similar choreographic muscle, if not the physical dance, exertions that you might associate with physical theatre. Great. I suppose we might need to fill our listeners in a bit on the style that we're talking about and the kinds of work that the company has tended to make. Andrew, maybe you could speak to that a bit.
Yeah, so I think those early pieces that we talked about, like Hotel Methuselah and Kellerman, we were basically creating worlds which had a very large, often back projection, scenographic kind of world, a very narrow playing space, which Morven might want to talk about, because it really means what Morven's saying about in terms of your physicality and small moves. It's not like a normal box set where you've got lots of places to roam and move around in. This very narrow strip almost of a playing space, and then a front projection with apertures that could close down from top to bottom or even from side to side, almost like a graphic novel. And those shows had the actor track, if we want to call it that, pre-recorded. So we would, in effect, make a movie which the performers would perform in front of and lip-sync absolutely in time with the pre-recorded material. And that was mainly to do with the cost of technology. It was very, very expensive to re-edit and do things live. We just couldn't do it. So we'd always, in effect, create this master track. And then slightly later than that, we got released from that machine, and to be able to do more live, so that we could get actors on headsets and be able to speak the lines without having to be a slave to this master track. But in a sense, the same sort of relationship between an already pre-existing storyline that was often cinematic and a live relationship to it endured. And a lot of our work has been about that. Or slightly, we might even be challenging it. So, for example, in Heart of Darkness, which you saw, what we were really interested in that sort of scenographic space was the live recreation of the cinematic image, which you could create almost out of nothing. Pre-existing backdrops, but the actors could be on a table, and with a live green screen you could then project and put them in a world that, in that almost miraculous moment, they could sit in. But as Morven said, that really means the performers having to film. They're going to have to dance almost a choreography to be in the right place on the mark so that they can be in shot. They're going to have to act that moment, which isn't necessarily got continuity with the next moment they're doing, which you would normally in an naturalist play. You would have some sort of character arc which would take you from the kitchen sink to the armchair or the ironing board. None of that exists for these actors. Their continuity is always technical. You might want to talk about this.
Yes.
That you're always being impelled to get into a space to get the next shot. In this show that we're making at the moment, that's really the main drive of energy of it, is being in the right shot at the right moment in no time at all, because the film cuts. We're doing it in real time. So we project the original movie, which is 1,187 shots, Morven knows them better than me, one after another in sequence, and then our performers have to match and absolutely in detail each of those shots in real time. So you might have been a scene where you might say a couple of lines, and then in the second after you have to move 2 foot to get the next shot, which is a slightly different angle to the shot you've just made. But it's not natural at all that you're doing that.
Yeah, Morven, perhaps I could sort of ask you a bit about where character does fit in and all that, because it's a very unusual way of kind of performing on stage.
Yes.
It's perhaps quite common. It's recreating in some ways what you might do for a television or a film setup. Yes,
very much so.
How as an actor, as a performer, do you approach character in all this?
Well, it's interesting, Andrew mentioning the kitchen sink and the ironing board just then. I did a production of Look Back in Anger. I played Alison Porter in 2010, 2011 time. And I hadn't done a naturalistic play for a couple of years, I don't think, at that point. And the freedom that I felt that I had to go from A to B to to see. It's a wonderful play. She's a great character to play. And the actor Nick Kempsey playing Jimmy was just out of this world. Fantastic performance that he gave as Jimmy. And to sort of develop that relationship and to follow that character arc through the play was a real gift. And then going back to working with Imitating the Dog, it was really interesting when we made the 0 hour. My character's journey, Ilse Freitag, was followed through different versions of outcomes of history. So if the war had ended in a different way, how the world would have been affected, how my character would have been affected by that ending of the war. So it's snapping in and out of your character's journey through the piece. So it's very filmic in that way. When you make a film, quite often you're shooting out of sequence. So you'll shoot some scenes from the end of the script early on, and then you go back to earlier scenes where your character is completely different.
Yeah, and you might not even have the person that you're talking to in the scene.
Exactly, in front of you, which is very typical in Imitating the Dog setup when you're live in the space. So I think the challenges for actors' brains in lots of ways of remembering where your character is on their journey at any particular time it's a matter of bringing that performance in the moment when it's needed and then switching off and switching into a different headset, a different mindset when you're operating a camera and you're arranging props and you're moving from this point in the space to the next point in the space where you need to be to catch the next camera shot. And then you're on camera and you need to remember very, very quickly where you are, what your performance needs to be, how big it needs to be for the camera in a theatre space. All of that feeds in. So we have busy heads, I would say, as actors in Imitating the Dog shows. There are sort of 7 or 8 things at any one time that we need to be thinking about as opposed to 2 or 3 in a more naturalistic play.
I would say that does 2 things, if that's of interest. One is that, for example, in Night of the Living Dead, it really struck me watching the rehearsal this morning that the on-stage energy of trying to create the moment of fictional truthfulness, faithfulness to the film, is really quite frenetic and quite difficult. And there's something, and it also matches at moments the energy of the film. So there's a kind of terror of the characters on stage to get that right and to get in the right position. And sometimes people find it really difficult and they forget that they're actually not in a naturalistic play and they start talking to the person that he thinks in the real stage space with them when in fact the camera angle is completely the opposite. Something quite amusing about that and moving when you see this sort of almost reflex action back to what you're trained to do and then what we're telling the actors to do by our machinic approach. And I think that's a really interesting energy that's going on there. And also I think that one of the things I've always been interested in, that I like about theatre, that I always search for, and I don't know, it's going to sound a bit pretentious this, but I always look for what I call a kind of truthful moment where I really believe what's happening on the stage is happening for real for the first time. Now, film actors generally are very good at that, partly for the reason that Morven's saying, that they have to do it because they're not in a world where the continuity of that moment builds up for them to be in that scene really. So they have to walk on and be crying at the death of their child, for example, or a tragedy, without all the build-up to that, because they haven't had that bit filmed yet. Stage actors generally will build up to that moment, and then there's a kind of art that you know, whether you're a Stanislavski or whatever, you kind of build to that. I think what happens with our actors when it's really working is that we put them in this sort of regime where it's so disorientating from their habitual way of performing that they're suddenly compelled to be very real on the stage. When that happens for me, I go, that's very magical. Of course, it happens in the if you like, the straight theatre as well. But it's often harder for actors to find that space because they're so trained in a particular way to articulate the truthfulness of a scene. And for me, sometimes I find that a little bit wearing. Whereas when I see this other type of work, I go, "Oh yeah, that's really interesting." So I saw Forced Entertainment's new piece, which has got the kind of clowns. I don't know if you've seen it fighting, and all the time there's clearly a very choreographed set piece organisation of the scenic space. But at the same time, there's always this element where they're fighting and they're falling and they're trying to flee from each other. That can't be rehearsed. And I think It's a very different type of performance than Night of the Living Dead, but there's something similar in the dynamic here. They're never going to be absolutely right with the cameras, and the actor's never going to be absolutely right in relation to the camera. It's impossible. It's always been negotiated live in front of the audience, and for me that's really exciting. I hope it's exciting for the audience. We await that judgment.
Well, it's something that I'd thought about Heart of Darkness, actually, and yes, the Forced Entertainment's reference is, I think, quite apt, because they are constantly making work about things actually happening on stage, real things happening. Yeah. No matter how many years and decades of kind of prep have gone into that, but it's real people struggling to do something.
Yes. Yeah.
Real people, asking each other questions and answering with varying degrees of honesty. Or whatever.
Yeah.
With Imitating the Dog, you've got people really making a film in front of your eyes. And that's really, to me, that was fascinating, because the film is obviously artificial.
Yeah,
we can see the artifice of it being made by people like you, Morven, in front of our eyes. But you're really doing that. Yeah. We can also see that you're really doing that shot, and you're really looking over towards stage left, whereas actually the person you're talking to is standing somewhere over stage right.
Exactly.
And that was something I found really compelling. And just, on a very banal level, the skill and awareness that it takes to get the eye lines right and things like that when you're doing work like that.
They're obsessed by all that, and I like that. I mean, as directors, often you're looking at the larger stage picture. What I think's great about working with this bunch of performers is that kind of level of detail. They're going to be working on by themselves, which allows you to look at the larger stage picture.
So tell us a bit more. I'd like to go into the specifics of this particular production, but just before that, tell us a bit more about the group of performers that you work with, because I understand there are often a lot of returning. It's almost sort of an ensemble feel to some extent.
Yeah.
What does that facilitate, I suppose? Do people get better and better at these setups? Do you feel that there's a sense of expertise within the group, or is it always
You work faster because the performers that you've worked with before, who know the kind of dynamic that we're exploring, you're not having to slow down to explain it in terms of, just in terms of not only just the kind of banal aspects of how do you work a camera, how do you pick it up, how do you take it off its tripod, which are all quite difficult, skillful things that you need to learn, but also what your relationship to the camera is, and perhaps as important, what the stage picture you're creating in relationship to the camera and the image that you're producing. Because it's very easy to forget the stage picture and only focus on the image that you're creating, but actually the stage picture is crucial. This is the choreographic nature, the kind of dynamic that Morven was talking about early. The performers that we work with regularly, always 90% of the time, are making really interesting stage pictures themselves in relationship to these tasks that we're giving them as a process of image making within the space. New performers bring a different energy, and there's definitely something interesting about that, bringing new performers. You see them having to deal with it, and that dealing with can also be really fascinating. The moment where you see their face totally lost is actually really brilliant. And there are moments, I was saying to Pete earlier, actually, if we could keep that, it's fantastic. But only we see that. Yeah. When you see the kind of actor going, oh my God, which camera am I looking at now? Which one is it? And you can see this moment of complete panic. It's kind of brilliant as well. But you don't want too much of that. Yeah. Otherwise it looks like you don't know what you're doing. Yeah. Sometimes, clearly, some people don't know what they're doing, and you have to rehearse that and routinise it so that they're safe and they're able to continue through the track that they're on.
And as a performer, Morven, do you find that those moments of sort of uncertainty diminish as the run goes? Because obviously, you have a tour, you repeat this and repeat this and repeat this. I'm just interested in sort of those genuine moments that we're talking about of what was next, or which way am I looking, or whatever it might be, versus like a construction of that, or some sort of, just expertise kind of taking away something from the performance for you as a performer, maybe.
I think with Night of the Living Dead remix, we won't have a choice. is my feeling now that we're 2 weeks into rehearsal. I think some of the shot changes are so quick because the film starts at the top of the show and it keeps playing. Right. And us as performers making our own version of that film live in front of the audience, we have to keep up. Yeah. We have no other choice. So we will fail. We will mess up some of the shots. but other times we'll get it spot on or nearly spot on. And I think there's a real pleasure for the audience in watching this group of 8 people struggle to try to keep up with the film. And it's very moving. I think it's interesting to watch. It's very beautiful to watch at times. But I think that perfection, we will just never achieve it, because, as Andrew says, it's impossible. But that's part of the game. That's part of the pleasure in the show.
Yeah, and the energy comes from the attempt to get it right. And that's where the pleasure comes in as well. Obviously, sometimes they do, and often they don't, or they get near it. And the nearness is really interesting as well, because you're looking at the already existing image and you're looking at the thing that's momentarily created before you then moves away, which again is very theatrical, because the film is there forever as long as film lasts, but the thing we make is never recorded. It appears for an instant and then disappears. It's a kind of cinematic theatricality which I really, really find fascinating, because film doesn't allow that.
Great. So tell us a bit more about the source material for this production then. I'm not assuming that people will be familiar with the film, although it's heralded as a kind of cult classic of the genre of the zombie movie. What can you tell us about the original film, and what drew you to it? Well,
the film was made in 1968, and what's really interesting about the movie is it's definitely a B movie, low budget movie. That's sort of where one might class it in terms of genre. But in its historical kind of, since it was made, it's clearly moved into its classic status, so it's sort of almost moved out of that. But the film is shot in this particular style. It's almost like a kind of form of documentary realism. So, and it's made by a group of people who are certainly on the edge of amateurs. There was a company that was making television adverts and short promo on film, not on video, because video didn't exist really then. They were a young group of filmmakers, producers, actors that sort of collectively got drawn together in Pittsburgh and were working. So it has this sort of amateurish, documentary, grainy reality to it. And the story is very simple. There's a kind of you're not quite sure. It's not absolutely clear in the narrative, but there's been some sort of satellite accident that's caused this sort of radiation burst that's come back and infected the Earth, and that infection has the dead have risen and are eating and attacking the living, and they're not called zombies in the film. They're called ghouls, actually, although very obviously they got classed as zombies in retrospect. And there's a series of key characters. There's a woman at the beginning called Barbara, who sort of flees after her brother's being killed to a house, which she tries to sort of find sanctuary in. And then this other person arrives in the house, who at the time was obviously very significant. So you've got this sort of African-American hero called Ben, who there really weren't many black actors playing those kinds of roles in any sort of Hollywood beyond the Sidney Poitier films, which obviously were in the earlier 60s. So you've got this person of colour playing this major character. They sort of team up, and then there's a group of people in the cellar that have been hiding, and they come up, and there's this kind of sequence where they attempt to survive the zombie horde that are outside the house. I won't go into all the spoilers, it's not necessary, but obviously things don't go too well. And Ben ends up as being the sole survivor for a short time, and then there's this very poignant and, one might say, political ending, which we're also very interested in, because clearly the film is haunted and framed in never directly referenced by the broader social unrest and politics of 1960s America. And I think it even goes back further than that, actually, to the 1950s America, because clearly when George A Romero and his colleagues were children, they were growing up in the kind of paranoia of nuclear Armageddon that America certainly perceived, that the duck and cover era of America, which was all about boarding up your house, going into the cellar, surviving. That's slightly transferred into their 1960s version of it, but it's haunted again by the civil rights, the assassinations of the two Kennedys, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X. It's all happening, the Vietnam, this sort of television war suddenly being on everyone's screens. It's all in the movie, indirectly, and that's something we were very, very interested in. Coming back to why we were drawn to the film, all those elements were fascinating to us, and in a sort of way, one of mine would say something about this as well, that connected us back to Heart of Darkness. Felt very much this is so different in style, so different in approach, but some of the themes, Heart of Darkness is dealing about empire and if you like, the fallout of empire, especially in light of the referendum in 2016 and what you might call populist politics in Europe, not just in England or in the UK. So again, it feels like some of these themes and concerns and anxieties that are going on Night of the Living Dead feel really relevant to us today. I don't know if you want to...
Yeah, absolutely. That sort of breakdown of societal, of an idea of community, of family.
Yeah.
I think many of us feel that we live in troubled and troubling times, and that paranoia that absolutely pervades the film. I forget that 1950s, 1960s America, the world, lived under this very new and very real threat of nuclear Armageddon.
Yeah, it's interesting that, because I was talking to my father about this actually over Christmas, and he reminded me that in 1960, he'd done his national service in 1958 as an 18-year-old boy from Cornwall who'd never left Cornwall in his life till that point. So he went to Germany, did his national service for 2 years. In 1960, he was called up to stand by during the Cuban Missiles Crisis.
Right. Yeah.
He got a letter saying you have to be ready to go to some sort of war at 5 hours' notice.
Yeah.
And that's how paranoid and how fearful people were that a major conflict was about to occur. We obviously haven't had that very often since then, but... it's definitely in the background of our imaginations, I would think. And coming back to this idea of one of the themes of the film, which is often overlooked, is this sort of ecological, technological catastrophe that's underpinning it. It feels, even though it's very much a metaphor in the movie, that has resonance now, that we're, all this around us, he says, gesturing to the city, is quite a fragile structure, with climate change or other types of technological disaster that might befall us. And the movie does definitely investigate that.
Yeah. So in your production of Heart of Darkness, I was really interested by the way that you wove the kind of post-colonial stories and critique, really, of that work into what you were doing on stage, what you were presenting on stage. Presumably in Night of the Living Dead, you don't have time to do any of that. It's more sort of what makes it kind of apt and pertinent for now.
Yes, but what we do, there are moments in the film which are... in the cinema, they're very, very necessary. They're kind of moments of quiet and silence where Ben, the main character, is boarding things up, or people are sort of just gathering their strength. In the cinema, that really is necessary, because it then waits for the next sort of shock moment, which is is coming. On stage, it's a little bit. It's still very nice and it's got a kind of beauty to it, but it feels like there are moments that we can do something else.
Right.
So, in those moments, we do bring some documentary. I think of it as layering. It's almost like layering over the existing film another element. So we do have for example, at the moment, whether this stays, I don't know, but it's very likely to, a sequence whilst Ben is boarding up the house of one of the actors, Matt, is voicing Robert Kennedy announcing the death of Martin Luther King. And one of the things that's happened, one of the things we haven't mentioned, which is this disorientating thing that Morven's talking about, is the film is in these in-ear devices all the time.
Right.
So they're getting the soundtrack of the movie and their lines, the whole film, in through one ear. And having to voice what they hear if it's their character or their moment. Similarly, if there's documentary stuff, the person who's doing the documentary moment, and we will be putting more in than we've got at the moment, voices the voice of Robert Kennedy. And I think it's a really interesting moment, because what we have as a mise-en-scene, if you like, what's in the scenic space, is the original film is in the back, it's on the screen as well. Ben is ghosting his actor track in the space, and layered on top of that is almost this sort of shimmering colour. Everything's black and white, of course, the movie's black and white, of this news footage of Robert Kennedy announcing the death of... So you get this kind of televisual colour moment, which is quite odd for me, because I grew up in the 60s with black and white TVs, but we sort of reverse it. Cinema in this is black and white, and TV is colour at the moment, shimmering through the skin of the movie. And we've got this idea at the beginning that the film opens with a kind of long shot of a car driving up the driveway.
A really long shot.
Really long, yeah. Through the whole title sequence. It's a series of cuts, really beautiful sequence, but quite uncinematic by today's standard. You wouldn't do that. But there's a kind of almost haunted for me as the Zapruder film of Kennedy's car slowly going through Dallas. Yeah. And we might put little bursts of that as a kind of just to tell the audience from the beginning that we have got this other social history in play in this scenic space as well. Yeah. We haven't tried it out yet, but we are definitely going to try it out very soon.
Great.
Have I missed anything out there?
I don't think so.
Oh, okay. You promising more than what's coming up in the next rehearsal?
Well, yeah. I mean, to be fair, the actors are really brilliantly struggling with the tasks that we're setting them. Sometimes we get completely lost in that.
It seems to me that besides the impossibility of reconstructing a film live, shot for shot, this film in particular offers quite a few challenges. I mean, there's a lot of fire, for instance, without wanting to give too many spoilers.
Yeah.
There are various special effect shots. There's a lot of locations, although obviously having seen Heart of Darkness, I've seen how you would tackle kind of different location work on stage. There are cars. How are you finding solutions to those kind of challenges? Maybe I could ask Morven.
Well, we have a model box that will be set up as stage left, so the audience will see the model box and us as performers operating the models within the pre-made sets. And it's really lovely. We're working with a fantastic guy called Matt Tully, who's working on those models. So there's a real beauty and a finesse and something very tiny and very fine about those model box sequences. But we don't want to hide that. We want to have that in the playing space so the audience can watch that operation of the dolls, of the car, the little model car, and those box sets.
Yeah,
but as much as possible, we are achieving things that one might usually think, we'll just do that in the model box. Yeah. We're trying to achieve those live in the space.
Yeah, and I mean, the fire one's a really interesting one because he's created this water vapour that sprays up, and if you light behind, looks like flame. So it's what you often use in particular type of model making. Yeah. So that kind of... We've got two versions of the fire. One is a more on-stage, slightly comical one, I suppose, an approximation, but still might look very good on camera. And we've got a more real one, even though it's only made with water and light, the sort of vapour that's in the model box. And there will be this juxtaposition between, I think as Morven says, between the on-stage version and the model box version. They're all approximations to the original. They're not ever really totally in line with the original.
No.
You'll know the model box is a model as much as you know that what's happening on stage isn't quite the film, but it gets damn close sometimes.
So not only do you have to be a physical performer and a sort of verbatim performer almost with the earpiece, you've also got to be a puppeteer.
Yeah.
Yes.
We're very lucky that our assistant director, Anna, first degree was in puppetry, so she's bringing some of that.
Yes,
skills.
Anna Marshall.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. There's a lot of serendipity in this production, actually. Thank God for the skill set that we need.
Night of the Living Dead remix previews from the 24th of January at Leeds Playhouse for a 3-week run before touring to Exeter, Nottingham, Dundee, Manchester, Kendal, Liverpool, Mould and possibly more. Andrew and Morven, thank you ever so much for talking to British Theatre Guide.
You've been listening to a podcast from British Theatre Guide. For more information, please visit britishtheatreguide.info.